Well, good morning. I'm Congresswoman Terry Sewell from Alabama's 7th Congressional District, and I'm honored to be joined by Speaker Pelosi, Leader Hoyer, Whip Clyburn today as we acknowledge 7 years. Yesterday was the 7th anniversary of the Shelby versus Holder decision, which gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, removing federal oversight and states with proven track records of voter suppression. We've seen in those 7 years over 30 states institute more restrictive ID requirements for voting. Likewise, we've seen a consolidation of polling stations, purging of rolls. We've seen a resurgence by states to suppress the vote. In December, I am proud to say that elections do have consequences, and the American people spoke up and spoke out in the 2018 election and ushered in a Democratic House majority. I am so honored that this caucus and that this House passed H.R. 4, a bill that I was proud to be a lead sponsor and which puts the teeth back into the Voting Rights Act, ensuring fair voting practices for all Americans. Shelby versus Holder, the Supreme Court was clear that the onus was on Congress to come up with a modern-day formula. They struck down Section 4B, which provided the formula for covered jurisdictions that had to be pre-cleared in order to have changes in voting laws. So Section 5 is intact, which is the pre-clearance provision. But Congress has to put the teeth back into the Voting Rights Act by coming up with a new Section 4B. And that's exactly what H.R. 4 does. H.R. 4 provides a modern formula with a recent look at voter discrimination by states and jurisdictions across this nation. And so we are very proud that we were able to pass H.R. 4, but like so many of our bipartisan bills, and it did pass with one Republican supporting H.R. 4, H.R. 4 is currently languishing in the Senate, where Senator McConnell refuses to call up for a vote. Why voting rights have become a partisan issue, frankly, is baffling to me. When we think about Congress passing not one, not two, but 3 reauthorizations of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and now all of a sudden our Republican colleagues have been using voting rights as a partisan issue. As elected officials, we should be working tirelessly to ensure that all Americans are able to vote. Over the past weeks, as our country has been grappling with the devastating murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, we have also opened the door to deeper and more substantive discussions about race, racism, and institutional racism in America. You know, a lot of my white colleagues and friends have reached out to me with questions, especially regarding the nature of systemic racism. They want to know what it looks like and how it manifests itself. And I believe that there's no more obvious example of institutional and systemic racism than voter discrimination and the anti-democratic practices that bar African Americans and people of color from exercising their fundamental right to vote. So you ask, what does racism in voting look like? Well, in the not-so-distant past, it looked like literacy tests and poll taxes, making African Americans guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, or recite how many counties are in the state of Alabama in order to get registered to vote. Today, voter discrimination looks like what we saw in Kentucky and last week, and what we saw in 2018 in states like Georgia. Polling stations shut down in African American neighborhoods with Black voters waiting in lines for hours on end. Voter purging from rolls on technicalities and strengthening and tightening of ID laws that discriminate, disproportionately have an impact on disadvantaged communities. Shutting down polling stations in neighborhoods of color, insisting upon forms of ID that require time and money to obtain, limiting access to polling locations so that only car owners with flexible jobs and child care have the ability to vote. This is modern-day systemic racism in voting. It is voter suppression. Ahead of our upcoming presidential election, and given the ongoing concerns in-person voting, it is more important than ever that we renew our call that H.R. 4 be taken up in the Senate and passed and signed into law. Our vote is our voice. The people know that our democracy is strongest when every American is able to make their voices heard at the ballot box. Today, I'm honored to be joined by the incredible leadership of the House of Representatives. Honored to have Speaker Pelosi and Leader Hoyer and Whip Clyburn standing up for all Americans having access to the ballot box. You know, this is personal for me. Not only do I represent the Civil Rights District of Alabama, my district includes Birmingham and Montgomery and my hometown of Selma, Alabama. The legacy of this district is that ordinary Americans aggrieved their nation, protested, bled, died, fought for the right to vote on a bridge in my hometown. That legacy must be upheld. And I am proud that House Democrats and the Democratic House of Representatives majority has taken H.R. 4 and passed it across the finish line. We must now call upon the Senate to do the same thing. We are honored next to hear from Speaker Pelosi. Thank you so much, Madam